How do you come up with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? Because you're fucking with a historical timeline.
He appeared in more than 200 films across 30 years. He is in 7 different movies on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 greatest films ever made. That is more than any other actor who ever lived. He was the detective in the Maltese Falcon. He was the preacher leading the cavalry in The Searchers. He was Bert the cop in It's a Wonderful Life, the movie millions of families watch every single Christmas. His face is woven into the greatest American films of all time. And for 30 years, almost nobody in those theaters knew his name. He was the man everyone recognized and no one could name. The big, gruff, barrel-chested fellow standing just behind the star, never the headline, the cop, the soldier, the priest, the friend. And here is what almost no one remembers. There was a hidden illness he carried his whole career, the thing that kept him out of the war and shamed him quietly for years. There was a day his closest friend, the most famous movie star on earth, fired a shotgun and put him on the ground. And there was a moment when this man was finally 54 years old and finally star, when the name nobody knew became the name everybody knew all across America. And then, standing at the very top of the mountain, it was over in an instant. This is the story of Ward Bond, the biggest small part actor who ever lived. Stay with me, because the way it ended, and the strange final gift he left behind will tell you everything about the way he lived. Number 1. The Hard-Knuckled Boy from Nowhere, Nebraska. He was born Wardell Edwin Bond on April 9, 1903, in Benkelman, Nebraska. If you have never heard of Benkelman, that is the point. It was a speck of a railroad town in the far southwest corner of the state, where his father worked in a lumber yard and the wind never stopped blowing across the plains. He was not a pretty child. He grew into a big, raw-boned, gruff young man, 6'2" and nearly 200 pounds, with a heavy brow and a voice like gravel rolling downhill. When Ward was 16, in 1919, the family pulled up stakes and moved west to Denver, Colorado, chasing a better life. Nothing about this boy whispered Hollywood. Nothing about him suggested fame. He was built for hard labor, for hauling and lifting and digging. He even started out studying to be an engineer. And for most of his life, even after the cameras found him, he would carry that working man's body and that working man's face like a badge. He was never going to be the smooth, handsome leading man. He knew it. The studios knew it. But that face, that big, honest, unglamorous American face, would one day become one of the most familiar faces in the entire country. The town that built him could not hold him. So how does a poor, plain-faced engineering student from the middle of nowhere end up on a movie screen at all? Number 2. The football field where he met the future John Wayne. The answer was football. Ward Bond was big and strong and downright mean on a field, and that earned him a spot at the University of Southern California, playing on the line for the legendary coach Howard Jones and the USC Trojans. In 1928, that team went undefeated and won the national championship. Ward Bond was a starter on it, and blocking and tackling and sweating right beside him on that line was a tall young man named Marion Morrison. The world would later know Marion Morrison as John Wayne. Here is the truth that gets prettied up in the legends. At first, these two did not even like each other. Wayne thought Bond was loud and unruly, but over late nights, cheap whiskey, and more trouble than either of them would ever fully admit, something hardened between them into one of the most famous friendships in Hollywood history. They argued constantly, they competed at everything, and underneath it all was loyalty so deep that, in Wayne's own words, it lasted until the day Ward Bond died, more than 30 years later. The two of them would go on to make 23 films together. Two faces the American audience came to expect side by side. Bond did not know it yet, but the friend he was wrestling in the dirt would become the most famous movie star on planet Earth. So how did a couple of football players ever get in front of a camera in the first place? Number 3. the director who walked into practice and changed everything. In 1929, a film director came looking for football players. His name was John Ford, and he was making a movie called Salute, a story about the rivalry between the Army and Navy academies that needed young men who could believably play athletes. So Ford did something simple. He went to the USC football team and started picking out faces. He picked Marion Morrison to help wrangle the players, and among the men they brought along was Ward Bond. There is a famous story from that shoot. Ford got furious when Bond ran up a hotel bill ordering steak and drinks on the studio's dime, and tried to throw him off the picture. It was Wayne who stepped in and saved him. And then, instead of staying furious, Ford did the opposite. He gave Bond a small speaking part, because Ford liked Bond immediately, and not because Bond was polished. He liked him because Bond was the opposite of polished. He was loud, crude, thick-skinned, and he could take a joke and throw one right back. To a tough old director like John Ford, that was pure gold. That one casual recruiting trip changed 2 American lives at once. Wayne would become a god. Bond would become something rarer. He would become the man who was in everything. But being discovered is not the same as being a star. And Ward Bond was about to spend the next decade learning that difference the hard way. So what does a man do when he is in the movies? But nobody knows who he is. Number 4. The 200 movies and the name. Nobody learned. He worked. That is what he did. He worked harder and more constantly than almost any actor in Hollywood history. Through the 1930s, Ward Bond appeared in film after film after film. Westerns, crime pictures, war movies, comedies, dramas. He played cops and soldiers and crooks and foremen and bartenders and sheriffs. In a single year, 1935, he appeared in 31 different movies. 31. He would show up, hit his marks, say his lines, and disappear until the next one. By the time it was all over, Ward Bond had appeared in more than 200 motion pictures. 200. Most actors are lucky to make 20 films in a lifetime. He made 10 times that. But here is the cruel arithmetic of the supporting player. The audience saw him constantly. They recognized him instantly. The big man with the gruff voice. It's that guy. But they did not know his name. He was scenery. He was furniture. He was the most recognizable stranger in America. For a lesser man, this might have broken something. For Ward Bond, it built something. He became the actor every director wanted, because he never complained, never demanded the spotlight, and always delivered. And one director in particular came to love him like family, even as he tormented him without mercy. Who was the man who humiliated Ward Bond on set, and then trusted him above almost anyone else alive? Number 5. The cruel genius who loved him like a son. John Ford was one of the greatest film directors who ever lived. He was also, by nearly every account, a bully, and Ward Bond became his favorite target. Ford brought Bond into his famous stock company, the loyal group of actors he used over and over. Across his career, Bond made 25 films with John Ford. He was in Drums Along the Mohawk in 1939, and Young Mr. Lincoln that same year. He rode in the cavalry in Fort Apache in 1948, alongside John Wayne and Henry Fonda. He carried a lead role in Wagon Master in 1950, the very film that would later inspire the television show that made him a star. He played the warm Irish priest, Father Lonergan, in the beloved The Quiet Man in 1952. And in 1956, he played the Bible-thumping Reverend Captain in The Searchers, regarded by many as the single greatest Western ever filmed. But that family came with a price. Ford insulted Bond, mocked him, played savage, practical jokes on him, and rode him harder than any other actor on set. There are stories that would make you wince. And yet Bond kept coming back, year after year, because underneath the cruelty was a genuine, fierce affection. Ford needed him, and Bond, the man nobody named, finally had a place where he belonged, and it was in these films that Ward Bond, the nameless face, quietly made himself unforgettable. So which scenes did this anonymous giant walk into and never leave? Number 6. The immortal scenes you have already seen. You have seen Ward Bond. I promise you that you have. You just did not know his name when you did. In 1941, in one of the greatest crime films ever made, The Maltese Falcon, that big, tough police detective leaning on Humphrey Bogart, that was Ward Bond. In 1939, in Gone with the Wind, the biggest film of its era, he was the Yankee captain. In 1940, in the heartbreaking masterpiece The Grapes of Wrath, he was there too. And then came 1946, and a film that flopped on its release and then became, over the decades, perhaps the most beloved American movie ever made. It's A Wonderful Life. Every Christmas, in millions of homes, the story of George Bailey plays again. And there, walking the streets of Bedford Falls, is Bert the cop, the friendly policeman. That was Ward Bond. He turned up everywhere across the decades. The war film They Were Expendable in 1945. The John Wayne Western Hondo in 1953. The tense drama Johnny Guitar in 1954. The comedy Mr. Roberts in 1955. And finally, in 1959, Rio Bravo, alongside his old friend John Wayne, one last time. Here is a fact that should stop you cold. Ward Bond appears in 7 of the films on the American Film Institute's list of the 100 greatest American movies of all time. More than any other actor in history. Not Bogart, not Wayne, not anyone. The man nobody could name is in more all-time great films than any star you can name. But a man can be in the greatest films in the world and still be fighting a private battle that shames him to his core. What was the secret Ward Bond carried? The one that nearly broke him when his country went to war. Number 7. The power he held and the lines he crossed. There is a part of Ward Bond's story that is harder to tell, and an honest telling has to include it. In the years after World War II, Hollywood tore itself apart over politics. Fear of communism swept the country, and an organization rose up inside the film industry called the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. Ward Bond was one of its most aggressive and feared members. So was his old friend John Wayne. And Ward Bond did not just hold his opinions quietly. He enforced them. One biographer described him as a self-appointed inspector, personally deciding whether other actors and writers were loyal enough to keep working. When the actor Anthony Quinn found his roles drying up, he came to Bond to be cleared. Bond looked him over, asked him point blank if he was a communist, and only when satisfied did he let him pass. That was the kind of power Ward Bond held over other men's livelihoods. To some in Hollywood, he was a patriot. To others, he was a man to be feared, and there were people who never forgave him for it. This is the complicated truth of the man. The same loyalty and stubbornness that made him a beloved friend made him to others a hard and frightening enemy. History does not get to pretend he was only the lovable cop from Bedford Falls. He was a real and contradictory man, capable of great warmth and real hardness, sometimes in the very same breath. But there was one battle Ward Bond fought entirely in private, against his own body, that almost no one ever knew about, and it struck at the one moment a man most wants to stand tall. Number 8. The silent battle that kept him out of the war. When World War II came, the men of Hollywood faced a question. Would they serve? Ward Bond suffered from epilepsy. It was a condition he carried quietly through his whole career, and when the war came, it disqualified him. He was classified 4F, unfit for service. Think about what that meant for a man like Bond. He played soldiers and lawmen, and fighting men on screen, over and over. His entire identity was built on toughness and duty. And when his country went to war, his own body kept him out of the uniform he had worn so many times in pretend. He watched other men ship overseas while he stayed on the soundstage. Playing at a war he was not allowed to fight. He never made it loud. He never asked for sympathy. He buried it, the way he buried most things that hurt. And he kept working, harder than almost anyone in Hollywood. The man who looked invincible on screen was living with something no audience ever saw. and he was about to survive something else that should have been deadly, fired by the hands of the most famous man in the movies. What happens when your closest friend nearly shoots you to pieces with your own gun? Number 9. The day John Wayne shot him. Ward Bond and John Wayne hunted together, drank together, and fought together their whole adult lives. And one day, out in the field, John Wayne shot him. It was an accident. The two men were out bird hunting, and Wayne had borrowed one of Ward Bond's own shotguns. A covey of birds flushed up. Wayne swung the gun to follow them, and he fired, and the spray of shot caught Ward Bond square into the backside. Now, the truth is, Bond was not badly hurt. The pellets stung him, embarrassed him, and gave both men a story for life. But think about what that moment could have done to a friendship. Your closest friend in the world, the biggest movie star alive, picks up your gun and shoots you with it. It could have caused a permanent rift. Instead, the two of them did what they always did. They folded the whole ridiculous thing into the rough, joking, brotherly language they had spoken since that football field at USC. For years afterward, they laughed about the day Duke shot Ward with Ward's own gun. But Ward Bond, being Ward Bond, was already planning the last laugh. Quietly, without telling almost anyone, he made a decision about what would happen to that shotgun when he was gone. He wrote it into his will, and he waited. And he did not have to wait nearly as long as anyone expected. Because just as the name nobody knew was about to become the name everybody knew, the clock was already running out. So how does the biggest small part actor in history finally become a star? Number 10. The final triumph, the sudden end, and the last joke. In 1957, after nearly 30 years as the man no one could name, Ward Bond was handed the role of his life. The show was called Wagon Train, and Ward Bond, at 54 years old, was its star. He played Major Seth Adams, the gruff, tough, big-hearted wagon master leading pioneers across the brutal American frontier. It was a role he was born for. Every hard mile of his life. The Nebraska dirt, the football line, the 200 forgotten parts, the cruelty of John Ford, the silent illness. All of it had built a man who could be Seth Adams, and the country fell in love with him. Wagon Train became one of the biggest shows in all of America, year after year, sitting at number 2 in the national ratings, behind only the Great Western Gunsmoke, and beating nearly everything else on television. Week after week, it climbed to the very top of individual ratings reports. It was beamed into living rooms from coast to coast, and across the ocean, it became the most popular show in all of Great Britain. And the miracle finally happened. The most familiar face in America finally had a name attached to it, Ward Bond. People knew it now. They said it out loud. After 30 years standing behind the star, he was the star. The reason millions tuned in. He had climbed the entire mountain. He was at the very top. And then, on November 5th, 1960, Ward Bond traveled to Dallas, Texas, to watch a football game, the very sport that had started his whole improbable journey decades before. And there, in a Dallas hotel, Ward Bond suffered a massive heart attack and died. He was just 57 years old. He died at the absolute peak, beloved, famous at last. The star of one of the biggest shows in the country. The man who waited his entire life to be known got to be known. And then, almost in the same breath, he was gone. John Wayne was shattered. He had lost the friend of his entire life. The man he had wrestled on a USC football field. The man he had accidentally shot. The man who had forgiven him without a second thought. Wayne stood and delivered the eulogy himself, calling Ward Bond a wonderful, generous, big-hearted man, and saying the two of them had been the closest of friends from school right on through. And then the will was read. And there it was, Ward Bond's last joke planned long in advance. He had left John Wayne the shotgun, the very same shotgun Wayne had used to accidentally shoot him all those years before. Wayne kept it, and the message could not have been clearer. Even from beyond the grave, in the only language the two of them had ever really spoken, Ward Bond was telling his oldest friend that all was forgiven and that he had loved him to the very end. That was Ward Bond, the boy from nowhere who became the face everywhere, the man who carried a hidden illness and never once asked for pity, the friend who could be shot by John Wayne with his own gun and turn it into a punchline that outlived them both. He spent 30 years as the man no one could name, and he died as the man all of America finally knew. He was never the most famous face on the screen, but he may have been the most necessary. Because the greatest films in our history needed a face like his standing in them, and the most famous star in the world needed a friend like him standing beside him. If this story of Ward Bond meant something to you, do me one small favor. Subscribe to the channel, because the man who was in everything deserves to be remembered by name. The face you have known your whole life finally has one. Ward Bond.